I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.
They'll buy from anyone who wants to sell to them. But we all know that before you can sell to customers, you've got to get to know them. You must understand something about them. What do the Negro customers buy? Why do they buy? How do you sell to them?
How you mean? I casket shopping.
Boy, I like the hat on you now.
Yeah, for real?
Boy, you white fine, boy.
Oh, I know I real out here now.
Wait, sir. I found a hat in the back designed by a black guy. Probably fit your income.
You must ain't know about our black buying power.
Oh, no. All right. I'll sell you the high price shit. Work for us. Give us money back.
See, I can have
No,
somebody
you
left over
ain't.
for the sugar shack about 10. You know, get us a little bail or something, you know?
Here you go, sir.
Oh, appreciate them. Hey, you know what? I want them bucket to know we less threatening and stuff. So let me get another hat. Let them boy know we ready to spend some money and shit. For real. Baby, you know what? I could just buy a bail for you. I ain't want nothing again, you know what I'm saying? Because we need a designated driver and stuff like that, you know? And you probably ain't got no money on gas, so we need to get some of that too. Yeah.
Here's your other hat, sir.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's it, Dick. Black and gray on the outside and straight white on the inside. Oh, ready for them boy now? Yeah, that's it, Dick. I'm about to show these buckers my buying power real out. Hey, baby, I look good?
That thing bad now.
Yeah? All right, straight up. Hey, let me get 2 more of them things. I can tell a light man I ain't got them this month, man. Yeah, I'm trying to get one of them bucker big pen right there.
Oh, no. I got something better for that. Maybe a pen that you can afford since you don't have as much power.
No, no, I ain't want them. Because if a black man make them, I know it ain't gonna work. The ball will dry up. You have to lick the tip. See what I tell you? No, I ain't want this thing in now.
You guys don't really have buying power. They just trying to quiet your revolutionaries.
Oh, yeah? That what them boy doing? Oh, shoot, I could try him again then and see if he still ain't work, man. Man, bump this pen, man. It ain't work, man. Give me that
All right.
expensive
Well,
shit.
look, your purchase of this white-owned pen will help us achieve national racial harmony.
I'll holler at y'all boy later, man.
I mix what
They'll
I
buy
like,
from
what I
anyone who
like,
wants
what
to
I
sell.
like, what I like, what I like. What's up, world? Welcome to another edition of I Mix What I Like Live, right here on Black Power Media. Again, I'm Jared Ball, happy to be your host. Greetings, everyone. Shout out to Geechee Yaw, whose Instagram should now be added to the show notes for setting us up in what I think is going to become a routine intro to these segments where we talk about buying power and the mythology and the recurrence of it, which we're going to get into first before we get into the main topic of the day, which is, of course, the Epic Games Fortnite most recent attempt and effort to corrupt and co-opt Dr. King. So as my man Math Hoffa says, not to suggest that we know each other, but I watch his stuff all the time. I watch his YouTube all the time. Get in here. He just had a really good conversation with Talib Kweli, by the way, and some others. But anyway, so greetings, everybody. Please jump in. Tell a friend to tell a friend to tell a friend, as the ear doctor says. Definitely hit the like, join, subscribe, and the bell. And help support and expand and share and join in the fun as I try to hold it down for this edition of a Boom Bap Breakfast. Speaking of which, before we get any move any farther, for some reorganization and scheduling corrections and some sort of channel-wide quick breathtaking. The Remix Morning Show will be on a quick and brief hiatus this week, and we'll be back next week at full strength. But don't worry, we have some specials. We have some offerings, shall I say, to hold us down in the interim before the reconstituted crew reconvenes next week. So I think we're far enough to say that I think on Wednesday morning we're going to have a very special conversation in this block with the daughter of Richard Wright, Julia Wright, Mama Julia, about the publication of their new book, The Man Who Lives Underground, I think is what it's called, if I'm not mistaken. And for a more, wide-ranging conversation about Mumia, political prisoners, the United Nations, all of which she's highly involved in. So that's one of the things. We're going to also have some other specials, something coming up this morning just to hold us down for our Boom Bat breakfasts. And then, of course, I'll be back on Friday to try to kick off the weekend. So appreciate you all bearing with us as we make these adjustments and keep it moving. All right. Okay, so that said, as we saw there, again, shout out to Geechee Yaw. We're going to see some more from him today and going forward. That's not the only contribution he's going to be making to today's program, whether or not he is aware of it. Certainly, good morning, everybody. Absolutely free Mumia. That's right. I got my Epic Games Dr. Ball jersey ready. This is, by the way, everybody, this is an early birthday gift from my cousin-in-law. It's a Panama jersey, 28 for the day of my birthday. Check it out though. Check it out. Can you see that? Bam. Got my name on the back. You know what I'm saying? Shout out to cousin Eduardo, who, by the way, rocked this jersey for real at one point in his career as a member of Panama's national team. So shout out to him and shout out for, the fly jersey. Absolutely. Big up to all of my Gullah Geechee people. No doubt. And not that I'm advocating this, and I get the conspiracy stuff, and, I'm not entirely comfortable that I did it, but I did do some years ago one of those DNA joints, and some of my roots run down that way. So apparently. So I'm proud of that. Not claiming it. I'm not going to start fronting like that, but I'm very proud of that. Shout out to them. Shout out to Geechee Yaw and the Gullah Geechee folks. All right. So this morning, a little bit of buying power, and then this Dr. King Epic Games thing. Thanks for showing up, not knowing what's coming. Saludos también, familia. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Okay. Let us proceed. All right. So initially, I definitely have to shout out Too Black of the Black Miss podcast for initially putting me on to this, and I've just had a chance to go through it. And as it relates to this ongoing promotion of economic myth and what in some ways my arguments around buying power have been trying to show. It was a story that came out the other day in the Washington Post. Right here, corporate America's $50 billion promise. And it's a long piece, so we're not going to go through the whole thing, but just a couple of excerpts that I just want to quickly highlight here that definitely relate to a lot of my own work and what we're doing here. Oh man. Anyway, now I'll save that. I got a story, but I'm gonna save that one. So as the story says, quote, looking deeper, because there was was it says here, a post analysis of racial justice pledges after George Floyd's death reveals the limits of corporate power to affect change. Now, I don't think many of us in this particular audience needed the Washington Post to let us know that corporations are not what's going to affect change, but uh um and I was very happy to see in the piece, which is in the show notes so people can see it on their own in its entirety, that Marisa Baradaran is quoted more akin to what I understood her work to be saying, which is that corporations and banks are not an answer here. And in fact, she says, as I think I have clipped here, but yeah, I do. So we'll get to that in just a second. But anyway, so I was very glad to see that. And I encourage people to read the entire thing. But for our purposes here, it says looking deeper, more than 90% of that amount, that is of the 50 billion, specifically $45.2 billion, is allocated as loans or investments they could stand to profit from. More than half in the form of mortgages. Two banks, JP Morgan Chase and Bank America, accounted for nearly all of those commitments. So what it's saying is that while there's this headline claim that major corporations are donating to what is meant to help Black people in the wake of George Floyd, what it shows is that most of it is coming from banks that it says here, to date, America's 50 biggest public companies and their foundations collectively committed at least $49.5 billion since Floyd's murder last May to addressing racial inequality, an amount that appears unequaled in sheer scale. But as I just read, looking deeper, more than 90% of that comes from JP Morgan Chase and Bank of America, and comes in ways that they could profit from. That is mortgages, investments, loans, and the like. Meanwhile, 4.2 billion of the total pledge is in the form of outright grants. Of that, companies reported just a tiny fraction, about 70 million, went to organizations focused specifically on criminal justice reform, the cause that sent millions into the streets protesting Floyd's murder by a Minneapolis police officer. And then it shows a little bit of the breakdown here that of the direct donations, which is just the 4.2 billion, because again, most of it is in investments, loans, mortgages. But of the donations, 2.1 went to economic equality. And as we'll see, what of course that means is financial literacy training, whatever, that kind of stuff. But which is again part of what I've been trying to show and continue to argue, that buying power is a small subset of trying to encourage, walk Black people and others, but Black people primarily, away from political organization, trying to assume political power. And again, by that, I do not mean voting for a corporate mainstream Democrat or something like that. I'm talking about, in an intentionally vague way, all by any means necessary, assuming political power. That is what determines how wealth is created and who gets it, or what even constitutes wealth, or how wealth is created. That's political power. And to keep us away from even thinking about that, we are encouraged in the smallest from them, but in the grand way, in many ways to us, to focus on our own ability to become financially literate, etc. 499 million to education, health, so on and so on. But again, That's only out of this 4.2 billion versus the 45.2 billion going to loans, investments, and other initiatives. The article continues, the 4.2 billion in grants to be dispersed over as long as a decade in some cases represents less than 1% of the $525.6 billion in net income earned by the 50 companies in the most recent year, according to the data from the S&P Global Intelligence. So you can see that here. 526 billion these folks made, and they've dispersed less than 1%. And in this next, let's see, among the investments aimed at narrowing the racial wealth gap. This was one of my favorite parts of the article that ties very nicely into what I've already linked in the show notes that we did a couple of days ago with Brother Kaba. Among the investments aimed at narrowing the racial wealth gap is the $28 billion in housing and business loans in Black and Latino communities that JP Morgan Chase has pledged with the goal of moving 40,000 families into home ownership over the next 5 years. PayPal is investing $500 million in Black and Latino financial institutions and venture capital funds. Google is donating $50 million in historically Black colleges and universities to increase Black representation in the tech sector. So this goes back to a number of things we've been talking about a lot on my humble little show here and elsewhere. One, again, encouraging that Black people channel their righteously angry militant political desires into home ownership and mortgages, or in terms of higher education, particularly in Black colleges and universities, encouraging STEM and tech. And as we talked about before, there is a history of this being connected to HBCUs being defunded after the Black Power uprisings and the civil rights movement, with an attempt to fund more quote unquote hard sciences that take people away from being more encouraged towards philosophy, political science, where you might engage critical thinking and ideas that would challenge the world as is. So if the HBCU, we've talked more than I would have even thought about this particular subject. The HBCU has intentionally been targeted as a case study, literally, for the study potentially of Black radicalism, and targeted for a place where Black radicalism must be suppressed, managed, and encouraged in another direction. And it's very interesting when you hear the stories of, like, I remember Dr. Carr telling the story about at Howard University when they had their protests in the 60s, and Debbie Allen, sister of Felicia Rashad, who's now returned as a dean, called home talking about she was joining the protests, and her parents said, "We didn't send you there to do that. You better get your butt back in class." Paraphrasing, in other words, we sent you there to be part of the Black bourgeoisie, not to be part of the Black liberation struggle. So we understand that these are sites of tension where there are inducements into different direction. But my favorite part about this particular line here about JP Morgan and Bank of America participating in Black and Latino housing and business loans is because, again, as we covered the other day in depth, but I just want to show very quickly here, this is where John Hope Bryant, colleague and partner with Roland Martin, comes into play to tell Black people with Operation Hope to follow his economic investment model, and looking at his partners, Bank of America, we can see, again, I'm not saying, I'm not attempting to, claim a one-to-one here, but it seems like that this is logical, that he's already on the board of, for instance, that neighborhood group, but he's working with as his job, Operation Hope. His point here, and we went in depth with this, the link is in the show notes. The point of this is to basically take white corporate funding to help Black people fix their credit and get a few Black people into mortgages that are being funded by JP Morgan Chase and Bank of America as an intentional part of this, at least in this most recent go round, as an intentional part of this post George Floyd response to Black rebellion. Which is why I thought, actually, you know what? I didn't even watch this. I think we should watch it together now. Because speaking of HBCUs, speaking of Roland Martin, and speaking of John Hope Bryant and the Nextdoor app and this buying power mythology, I was just sent this latest, well, what for me would be a latest. When did it actually? It's just a very recent. Tennessee State universities use Nextdoor to share resources, opportunities. Let's check this out real quick before we move on. And again, in the show notes, we've linked to where we really went into what Nextdoor is and isn't, and who's behind it, and all that kind of stuff. Wow.
The Hollywood Hills, and so we are here.
In this is a whole
Angeles,
segment,
of
okay.
course, doing a variety of interviews, and so we've been having a great time here. I cannot wait for y'all to see the great conversation that we have been having here. All right, folks. Every Tuesday, of course, we have our marketplace segment where we talk about Black businesses, and also in terms of what we are doing in terms of with technology. Sponsored by Nextdoor, the app that connects communities, folks in their communities. And one of the things that they have been doing is really emphasizing what HBCU students are doing, for them to stay connected when they get to their campuses. And so we want to talk about that. This, of course, is always something that's kind of important because, when you go away to school, you definitely want to stay updated with your peeps from your hometown, and there are things that you need, things that you're looking for. I love the posts I get from people who are looking for like a farmer's market, and looking where to get their hair done, and looking for a handyman, something along those lines. And so we've got 3 students from Tennessee State.
And remember, you got to remember the other video, right?
Joining us right now is Derek Sanders, Aubrey Sales, and Cedric Waters. Glad to have all 3 of you here. So, first of all, how are things going? Are you back?
I don't want to bring them into this. Let me just see. Shout out to the students, man. I love the students, man. I love their energy. I love that they want to do this. Here's the ad. Yeah, we saw this ad last time, because this is the one where they show, wasn't this the one where they show how happy, this is my man happily gentrifying the neighborhood, or surviving the gentrifying neighborhood, being, so he can alert his new white neighbors that he's not a threat. Yeah. That's the app, and that's the CEO. Okay. All right. That was interesting. But I think, from just getting back to the matter at hand, I mean, I do think that whether there's a one-to-one, or whether it's just coincidence, or whether it's just business as usual, It's interesting to note that this article points out specifically to the fact that there is a decided interest in using what little bit of money that they've made in 1 year. And by the way, that was just 1 year's earnings. 526 billion net was just 1 year's earnings. They gave 50 billion, only 4 billion of which is a donation, a straight donation. And only 2 billion of that is straight donations to people doing financial literacy and whatnot. The rest is going to encourage Black people to get mortgages, which will bring money, not only will likely bring or potentially bring a profit to them, but is ultimately of very little cost to them. So but anyway, the piece continues here. Profit-driven corporations will not propel transformational change with money alone, experts say. That will require corporate and government policy changes aimed at addressing the historic destruction of Black wealth, said Marisa Baradaran, a law professor at the University of California at Irvine, whose research focuses on financial inclusion and the racial wealth gap. The answer to these massive problems is not in capitalism doing better or more. It's not going to come from philanthropy. It's not going to come from promises. It's got to be a policy change, said Baradaran, who has informally advised companies on impact investing. We don't want just benevolent billionaires and nicer, softer, more woke monopolies. We want an economic structure that allows for more mobility, and we don't have that. So that's more akin to the Baradaran with which I'm familiar. But again, I think speaks to what is, of course, the problem here, that you're not going to get corporations who are bent on making wealth, extracting wealth. They're not going to be of much help. Now, I mean, I don't think we need an economic model that just makes room for more mobility, as she says. I would prefer to think of one that guarantees a level of wealth redistribution that makes inequality moot. But that's where our political differences are. She never promised to presented herself as anything other than that. And I think that what she says there is exactly right. That if you want the kind of change people say they want, you have to have policy. It's not going to be about philanthropy and the benevolence of rich whites. But the section, and this was, I think, specifically what Too Black was asking me to look at, or wanted me to look at for my own particular work and interests. And again, I appreciate that, is the section in the article on Black banks. And again, I've linked the whole thing so you can see it's a pretty extensive piece that more or less reaches the conclusion that where we all start from. But again, the deposits, as it says here, started soon after George Floyd's death. That's an interesting term too. Tens of millions of dollars from some of America's largest companies to a small Black-owned credit union in Mississippi. First came 10 million from Netflix, followed this year by 10 million each from PayPal and Nike, along with smaller deposits from Thermo Fisher Scientific and other corporations. We pretty much went from 0 to 54 million in corporate deposits over the past year, said Bill Bynum, chief executive and founder of Hope Credit Union. The influx of corporate deposits to Black-owned banks and other financial institutions, more than 1 billion in all from the 50 companies surveyed by the Post, is supposed to enable the undercapitalized banks historically founded to serve Black people to make more home and small business loans in low wealth communities. But the cash and corporate goodwill come with complications. Some banks were unable to absorb all the money that corporations wanted to deposit. Many Black banks lack the shareholder equity required by regulators to cover potential losses and protect deposits, which customers can withdraw at any time. This is, for me, the crux for this section, the part of the argument that of why these tactics could never work, and why trying to extrapolate from other examples or models or other communities or experiences or the experiences of an individual or small amounts here or there is flawed. You can't just dump money into a bank and then expect that it can distribute it in ways that will enrich a community when through regulation or just the broader economic reality, that money isn't going to have the kinds of returns that require backing and protection to cover potential losses with shareholder equity. In other words, the people that have invested in the bank, the primary and lead investors in the bank, certainly the owners of the bank, don't have enough equity. They don't have enough wealth. They don't have enough anything to guarantee the money that, were it to be deposited, were it to be lent out, were those loans to fail, that the bank wouldn't collapse. So that often prevents banks, to the extent I've been following this, from being able to expand. And which is why, as I tried to argue in a small way in my own work and looking at research on this subject, what ends up happening in the economic scholarship and literature, when they make honest comparisons about and assessments of Black-owned banks, they compare them, if at all, when it comes to white America, they compare it to small, local, white, poor, like farmer, poor white community banks. And the same issues exist. Those poor white communities, even in a white supremacist colonial situation, cannot expand because they don't have equity in the bank. They don't have the potential on return investment, given the poverty, the lack of assets, the lack of land, all of the of wealth, etc., in their community. So in the literature I was looking at, they're saying, look, Black-owned, the biggest Black banks, or all Black banks combined, more or less equate to, maybe not the smallest, but a small white bank. And certainly individually, these Black banks, like are being discussed here, cannot absorb a whole bunch of money. So it was even like the example I was using a few months ago about the individual that the Post covered, the Black puzzle maker, who all of a sudden started getting all of this. He didn't have the ability to scale up his business to satisfy all of the increasing, and were they to continue, the ever increasing amount of orders. So you can't, what you need is the ability, as Baradaran shows brilliantly in her own work, you need, for a bank to expand, it needs access to the global market. So as she says, you can segregate people, but you cannot segregate money. And a small Black bank, or a Black-owned bank like this, is segregated from the broader global economy because it doesn't have enough wealth or assets to invest in it. It doesn't have a community that it's serving that can promise the returns on investments or loans that would allow for it to make money or encourage more capital investment from the outside. So what these banks need, as the article continues, most is equity, long-term investments that allow them to take on more deposits that they can use to make loans. Without additional equity, Bynum said, Hope Credit Union is limited. And by the way, this is a credit union. So shout out to some in our nationalist community who have even in some friendly interviews directly taking shots at my work, saying, well, if we develop a credit union, Jared's argument no longer applies because credit unions and banks are different. Well, yes, there are differences, but essentially they're not significant differences enough that the adjustments that he claims or others might claim could happen. So the same thing here. This is a credit union, is limited in its ability to lend to Black families across the Deep South who are shut out from traditional banking system. Residents in communities without access to banks and credit unions, nearly a third of Black neighborhoods nationwide, compared to just a tenth of white ones, are instead more likely to rely on predatory lenders who charge exorbitant rates for mortgages, car notes, and emergency loans, research shows. Deposits are great, but they should be matched by a 10% contribution of equity capital, Bynum said. That will enable Black banks and credit unions to absorb more deposits and put them to work. Many companies remain reluctant to invest the equity that banks need to mitigate risk. That wasn't going to work with what we were given. This was funny, and it actually was reminiscent of a call I was on with a former group of colleagues at my university with Netflix. Quote, that wasn't going to work with what we were given authority to do and what works for our business, Netflix treasurer Shannon Alwyn said. While she said Netflix has no plans to withdraw its deposits, having that option is important. For us, liquidity was definitely a factor. So in other words, as I read it, she's saying, and Netflix is saying, look, you all aren't going to be able to pay us back. And we're not going to invest for real, because you can't make any money off of you. Sign up for our Netflix account. Her colleague Erin Mitchell, Human Resources Director at Netflix Animation Studio, began researching the possibility of investing in Black banks last spring before Floyd's murder, when he saw the disproportionate impact of coronavirus pandemic on Black-owned businesses. He and his colleagues read The Color of Money, Black Banks and the Racial Wealth Gap, and spoke with author UC Irvine law professor Marisa Baradaran about how Black banks have been systematically starved of the capital they needed to thrive. 2 days after Floyd was murdered, Mitchell emailed Netflix CEO Reed Hastings and proposed that the entertainment giant move $100 million, approximately 2% of its cash holdings, into Black banks. That sounded like a meaningful number, Mitchell said, and looking at the amount of cash we had, it was a small enough number not to cause too many alarm bells. I love that. Nobody's going to notice 100 million going out. It's just 100 million. 6 weeks later, Netflix transferred $10 million to Hope Credit Union in a rolling 3-month certificate of deposit, the company's first deposit into a Black bank. It has since expanded its efforts beyond Black banks, moving an additional $60 million into financial institutions that support Black communities. Few companies outside major banks such as JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, and Wells Fargo are making equity investments in Black banks, Bynum said. The big banks are expected by law to meet the credit needs of underserved communities, and regulators consider their record of doing so when evaluating the applications for mergers, acquisitions, and branch openings. And so Bynum is turning to a U.S. Treasury program launched this spring aimed at injecting $9 billion in capital into minority and community lenders. Now, this is again headed towards the direction I'm talking about. Don't go to Black communities talking about invest your little bit of money and your financial literacy and buying power, blah, 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 blah. Get federal with it. That's the point. That's public policy that determines where the Treasury is going to invest. Bynum says he plans to apply $108 million in U.S. Treasury funds, which would quadruple Hope's equity. That would allow Hope to expand lending in impoverished communities across the Black Belt, offering a more affordable alternative to some prime lenders. The role of government is closing opportunity gaps that market forces like corporations are not equipped to adequately serve, Bynum said. When the market fails, government should step in, and the market has historically failed and continues to fail communities of color. Now, this again is an important statement for me, and one that, if you read Marisa Baradaran's book, is consistent with a long line of Black moderates and conservatives. So this is not even the radicals' argument that Bynum is representing here. Going back to folks like Andrew Brimmer and others that Baradaran and Nathan Connolly at Johns Hopkins and others they put me onto these folks. These are not revolutionaries, but they said the same thing. Corporations can't do it. This is not an issue of financial literacy. This is not an issue of Black businesses. This is not an issue of what Black people do with their money. It's an issue of federal government arrangement. When CEOs began issuing public statements in response to Floyd's murder, Bynum had reached out to Dan Schulman, president and chief executive of PayPal, with whom he had previously traveled the country promoting a documentary about the impact of payday lending. So again, he's, I don't know. He made the one statement. Now he's back to his PayPal buddies. PayPal ultimately committed $400 million to Black and Latino focused financial institutions. I guess he's playing both ends. I guess I understand that, including deposits $10 million in Hope and $50 million in Opus, a Black owned bank in South Carolina. Anyway, that's the tenor of, and that's ultimately how it ends. What happens if in 3 years, if everyone calls their money back? Meanwhile, I've made a bunch of 10-year loans to Black-owned businesses on Main Street, he said. What a bank like ours needs is patient investors. You cannot reverse a 400-year legacy of carefully constructed systemic racism with a 2 or 3 year deposit. So there, it seems like he's almost coming back to the point about how Black people behave. Or it's a two-pronged, at least, argument. On the one hand, he's saying, listen, we need public policy. We need something more than corporate claims of being benevolent. But on the other hand, Black people can't be in a hurry. And if they come and pull out all their money, while I've given out 10-year loans to Black-owned businesses, which I'm not expecting to see for obviously 10 years, there's no money and the bank collapses. And it cannot perform what many hope and claim it is here to perform. So, all right, so that was that. Again, shout out to 2 Black. I appreciate him putting me onto that article the other day, and it's just another reminder that those with wealth understand what they try to teach those of us without. That it's political power, not financial literacy. It's not buying power. It's not a business. It's financial literacy. And one of the reasons, as we'll get to now, that I think we remain, one of the components, I would say, of this broader range of propagated mythology, one of the reasons why so much of this is effective is because so much of our radical analyses historically have been distorted and rebranded, often posthumously, as is the case as we're going to get to now with Dr. King, making it more difficult for us to even understand or interpret our current reality. So let's get to that right now. I mix what I like.
Now, the presence of the drum major instinct is why so many people are joiners. You know, there are some people who just join everything. And it's really a quest for attention and recognition and importance. And they get names that give them that impression. So you get your groups, and they become the grand patron. And the little fellow who is henpecked at home needs a chance to be the most worthy of the most worthy of something. It is the drum major impulse and longing that runs the gamut of human life. And so we see it everywhere, this quest for recognition, and we join things, overjoin really, that we think that we will find that recognition in. The presence of this instinct explains why we are so often taken by advertisers. You know, those gentlemen of massive verbal persuasion. And they have a way of saying things to you that kind of gets you in the bind. In order to be a man of distinction, you must drink this whiskey. In order to make your neighbors envious, you must drive this type of car. In order to be lovely to love, you must wear this kind of lipstick or this kind of perfume. And you know, before you know it, you're just buying that stuff. That's the way the advertisers do it. I got a letter the other day, and it was a magazine coming out, and opened up, Dear Dr. King, as you know, you are on many mailing lists, and you are categorized as highly intelligent, progressive, a lover of the arts and the sciences, And I know you will want to read what I have to say. Of course I did. After you said all of that and explained me so exactly, of course I wanted to read it. But very seriously, it goes through life. The drum major instinct is real. And you know what else had happened or causes happen to happen? It often causes us to live above our means.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.
It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring. I have a dream today.
Steady. The game jam was really just came from this idea of like, we want a refresher. You know, we've been spending the last 8 years on Gears. Let's just take a week as a company and let's just take a breath and fire up some different thoughts. And so it was kind of interesting that it came out of that was, hey, there's a couple of things that are viable that maybe we want to talk about. And then the discussions around what happened at Game Jam is actually kind of what led to Fortnite. And Fortnite wasn't a direct result. It wasn't one of the games in the Game Jam, but that process was kind of the fuel that caused that to become created.
I think it was August of 2011. I was actually one of the first people to work with the very initial kernel of this team. It's a game that spawned directly from passion. This is just something that people wanted to build. We were just coming off of Gears, and we wanted to do something totally fresh with this one idea that we wanted to basically do like a building game. So we looked at a bunch of games for inspiration. We loved Terraria. We loved Minecraft. We thought these were really awesome games. We also had, interestingly enough, we had farming for a little while, where you would grow crops. We just thought let's do whatever. Let's see what feels right. I think a lot of other people have done versions of this, but like they've done just one aspect. Like they've done building really awesome, or they've done the shooting really awesome. But this is sort of the peanut butter and chocolate. And I think we're finally putting those two together to make the really awesome cup. I feel like this game is sort of in the zeitgeist. You know, other developers that we've shown this game to have come and said, you know, we were going to make that game, and then we heard you were doing it, so we stopped. Or like, I've had that game in my head for the last 10 years, and I couldn't convince, you know, our studio to build that game. I just think it was in the water. People
wanted to show this a little bit.
People want to build blanket forts, and the floor is lava, and you are playing hide and seek, and you are just playing in sort of the landscape of your brain and just going nuts. When you're doing a game jam game, you just experiment. You go all out. Whatever works. So the game was super rough. It was done in UE3, and basically you used whatever assets you could get. So Fortnite originally was a lot.
I think it shows at least a little bit of just the general worldview of the people that created Fortnite. And how from there, whether, you know, consciously or unconsciously, their worldview forms the conclusions that they've reached and what we're now here to talk a little bit about. I did just see a question here real quick. And Jordan, this is not a dumb question. Do Africans outside the U.S. believe in the buying power myth and Black capitalism? Absolutely. This is a major problem. And in fact, there's even been some discussion, admittedly, we haven't gotten far enough, but there's been some discussion I've been having with a brother that I know out of that Africana, that Cornell Africana James Turner circle, who does some publishing, and we were talking about doing a a myth of African buying power, or something to that extent, like a part 2 or something that focused on some case studies throughout the continent. Obviously, we haven't gotten far enough because the reality is that they do. Now, the summary response that my oversimplification, and obviously there are differences. We're talking about an entire continent, but at the same time, my experiences, and I've been even on a couple platforms debating this or discussing this, is that whereas my argument is we need to assume political power to make these economic conversations moot, a lot of what comes out of the more prominent or popularly discussed, I know there's always a revolutionary undercurrent marginalized, is that unlike here, where Black America or African America or where Africans in America have sought to engage and bring in federal and then ultimately supra federal, like United Nations support for our struggle here, a lot of what has been encouraged in the continent, because there's been an assumption that African people had assumed political power and that the problem was their corruption, that their focus has become private business as a solution. And within that has come, from my limited experience, this contradiction that their argument ends up becoming, well, if we develop a business and a business acumen, or develop upon our business acumen, we can overturn their corruption. And here we're saying the same thing to overturn, I guess, the corruption of both private and public. But in each case, I think we're missing the point that we need political power and not the development of business. So, but yes, the short answer is yes, they do. It is a global problem. It has just been targeted and developed specifically here in ways that I'm not familiar with outside of the United States. So, all right. All right, so we saw a little bit of that. I did want to start with the drum major piece because Dr. King obviously talks most directly about the power of advertising and manipulation. And it's something that he was thinking about more than I think I've realized or focused on in what would be considered my study of King. And when I went back to prepare for this morning, there was something that I had not ever, I don't ever remember this. If I ever knew it, I certainly didn't remember it. And, so it felt brand new, but, that Dr. King immediately after the 1963, I Have a Dream speech, went and sought to copyright protect that speech from being resold without permission. So immediately he understood. Now I've understood from the different perspective. Like he understood he was in front of the world, that there were cameras, there was a TV, there was a press, there was all of this happening. He was not naive in that respect, but I did not realize to what extent and to what level of detail this was being paid attention to. And the reason I bring it up now is because, as I titled this video, he had already lost the fight with Epic Games way before this year. MLK lost his fight after his radicalism was erased posthumously and with great effect. This is just the latest in a long line of egregious abuses. Even before his death, he was already suffering from this. He was already being falsely pitted against Malcolm X in the press. I've linked in the show notes to some work I've done on this, that in the process of which cites and references, I think, even more important and greater work on this particular subject. So I encourage people to follow up later on and get those details. But essentially, he was already being rebranded from well, in one context, going from being touted as Man of the Year in 1965 to shortly before his assassination in 1968 being demonized in the popular press as an ignorant, naive fool, a buffoon, a clown, silly and foolishly running around after Stokely Carmichael and other Leninists, threatening national security, speaking on Vietnam and internationalism and anti-colonial movement. I mean, he was already being demonized. He had already been before that pitted against Malcolm X in the press as the one that we should want to support. He was used to make Malcolm look worse. And then when Malcolm was assassinated, he himself was made to look worse so that they could prop up more mainstream, commercial, centrist leadership. So I mentioned the other day that I had seen the Summer of Soul documentary. Who pops up in there? Of course, Jesse Jackson. 1969. He's now the putative, appointed, anointed leader. King has been assassinated. He did the whole wearing his blood thing. He did the whole let's take Dr. King's programs for direct action and redistribution and turn them into corporate grabs that he and Andy Young have popularly turned into a wave, a tsunami wave of anti-King analyses and interpretations, all draped in "We are the heirs of King," which is why, as I talked about for years, they were crying at the monument unveiling and all this other nonsense that King would have himself never supported. And that's why, of course, Andy Young pops up now, giving horrific JP Morgan Bank advice and money to Killer Mike in the Greenwood Bank Initiative. Remember, as we reported here, 40 of the $43 million that bank had raised had come from JP Morgan Chase through their connections, obviously, with Andy Young, maybe, so as part of this as well. So, but as I said, right after the 1963 speech in March on Washington, King moved immediately to protect his copyright and did win protection against the sale of the speech until 1994, when the evolved Dr. King family estate won an injunction against CBS. So in 1994, CBS was going to do a sort of 20th anniversary retrospective, or 30th anniversary retrospective, or whatever, or 30th anniversary retrospective, and wanted to use excerpts of the speech they had themselves documented in its original performance by Dr. King. And the family stepped in and said, no, you can't do that. I actually read some of the ruling, and it's based on a lot of very interesting case law. But essentially what they said was that initially King had a right against the resale of his speech, even though he had said it publicly, where some might have argued he lost the right to have it copyright protected. But when the family came back, and really it's not the families, we're going to talk a little bit about, the estate is more Dexter King than the rest of the family. But when the estate, and really it's not even him as much as it is, as we're also going to talk about IPM, or intellectual property management, which is none of them. But what they were saying is that no, even though he said it publicly, even though you were the original, even though you want to use your own original footage, CBS, his attempt to previously copyright, and now our estate attempt to protect the image that we have control over, you don't have the right to do that anymore. So I made a little note here that again, maybe Marshall McLuhan was right, that the medium is the message, because if you say it publicly in a crowd, you can retain control over it. No, you do not retain control over it. You only retain control over it when using the specific mass communicative technology of mass communicative technology. And once that which allows for the consolidation of power and control, that's when you have control over it. So once it was deemed as a non-public statement, it did become the private property of the estate of Dr. King. By the way, I'll just remind, and it's in the show notes, the details of this are there in those links, but it's also after the 1963 speech that the state says very clearly Dr. King is a target. William C. Sullivan, running COINTELPRO for J. Edgar Hoover, said, "Oh, that's it. He's the most dangerous Negro in the threat of spreading communism." Which may, as he connected it to, as we've talked about before, be connected, and the state needs to be worried about his affinity for Cuba and Castro. So, but ever since then, Dr. King has been struggling posthumously, well, even before his death, but certainly posthumously, against the public depiction of his ever-increasing radicalism. So, as I've said, in his life, as he got more radical, he was more demonized and marginalized and ultimately assassinated. In his death, he has been repackaged and rebranded and memorialized, certainly down the road in DC, as somebody who is unrecognizable to the man that actually lived in the last few years of his life. So all of his anti-colonial, anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, his pro-Pan-African, his pro-internationalist, his pro-socialist, all of that rhetoric, all of that analysis, all of that anti-war, vigorous anti-war, connecting it to the struggle here of Black people, all of that is either fully diminished or either diminished or erased entirely. So MLK's immediate attempt to protect his image went for naught, given that once he was killed, he lost control over his political image. And I would argue, even though I wrote this, I would even add to my own writing that it even started before he was killed. But he had lost control over his political image and then his legal likeness, and by now has been totally divorced from himself, even by his own children. And that's one of the points I want to raise here, because in looking up, because a lot of the questions online were how could a game get away with doing this? And where is the family's involvement in this? And are they, supportive of this? Well, Bernice King, as she says here, who heads the Martin Luther King Jr. Center. The King Center does not license Dr. King's intellectual property and therefore was not involved in any decisions concerning the endeavor with Time Inc. and PlayStation Fortnite. These licensing decisions are made by intellectual properties management. Okay. So how does that work? Well, who is that? Well, intellectual. So first it has to be understood that as she says here again, I just want to show one more from her Twitter feed, from her direct Twitter feed, that is. Decisions around licensing my father's intellectual property are outside my personal purview. And as she's retweeting here, that of the center itself. So how does that work? So there had been, and I had forgotten about some of this stuff. And first, well, we already went through that. I'll skip that. But if folks maybe remember, or if folks never knew, there has been a contentious beef of sorts from within the family. And some years ago, this is 2015, trial avoided. Dexter King dismisses King Estate's case against King Center. So you have the King Estate against the King Center. The King Estate is Dexter King. The King Center is Bernice, Martin Luther King III, etc. And what they were saying here is that the King Estate had voluntarily dismissed a lawsuit that they were for years holding up against the King Center, saying, look, the King Estate owns the copyright. The King Estate owns the license. And because of some personal beef, because of some arguments about where the money was going to go, who was going to get what part of the cut, Dexter started threatening and said, well, if I don't win, you all cannot have the name, and the King Center would be illegally then said to be using the King name and would have to give it up. So they ended that fight. So my point is that that Dexter evolved or took over the estate. The King Center was taken over by his siblings. They did reconcile in 2015 over the licensing of the name for the center, and they agreed to a more, I guess, agreeable cut of what was said to be around $30 million worth of King licensed or I think auctionable goods, and or there's a combination that comprised that number, but that money was what they were arguing about. And for instance, as it says here, just in terms of how this was working a little bit, even before now, it's the King Estate that had to approve, for instance, the 2018 Rams Super Bowl ad, in which it says in this article that they were paid $800,000 for the licensing of the monument. So the article is saying, I don't know how much Ram paid for the Super Bowl, but the monument paid $800,000 for the license of what is now the Dr. King Monument in DC, which, you know, doesn't represent his politics. Some have said look more like the Chinese guy that made it than King. But regardless, it was $800,000 that was paid for that. All right, that's more about that. Okay, so this is who the King Center have controlling or running their licensing agreement, intellectual property management. At IPM, the principals of the business have over 80 years collective experience between them in the fields of image rights advisory, intellectual property, and wealth structuring. Our clients have access to at least one of our four principals. Or I'm sorry, at least one of our principals. It is this director-led approach to relationships that we believe is key to providing clients with a highly personalized service in a cost-effective manner. For more information on the principles, please see below. So again, part of the reason why I'm arguing that King lost this battle with Epic a long time ago is because not only, I mean, we could even argue that not only did he see in his lifetime a movement he helped head in the direction that he was ultimately trying to get us to go in. This was the man that was talking about, redirecting rental payments to the refurbishing of those communities as opposed to the landlord. Permanent settlement encampments on the lawn in DC and in the White House or wherever, until there was no war and justice was in other words, he was talking about direct action to confront and stop the normal flow of business. He was talking about redistribution. He was talking about ending war. He was talking about the Black struggle being connected to international anti-colonial struggles. He's then assassinated and turned into, on the one hand, a corporate shill for McDonald's and whomever. And as I'll get to in as when we come back to Fortnite, it's logical that he would have ended up here, unfortunately, because he had been turned into whether selling, Ram, McDonald's, or worse, being used to sell a brand of politics that he himself in life organized against. That is some mainstream, support a Democrat, lesser of evils, give us some money, so we can claim to be doing the work of social justice, when in reality we want, just a handout and maybe a black person on your board. Like that, he's already he suffered all of that already. He suffered going from man of the year in the popular press to being targeted, I would argue, for assassination by being called a threat to national security in the headlines of the Washington Post. 90 days of less than 90 days before he's killed. Like that's what he's suffered. So by the time we get to this, where his children, who, as others have pointed out, with I think to great effect, I mean, it wasn't just Dr. King that within that family didn't, and I don't want to get caught up in spreading misinformation, but correct me if I'm wrong. Look into the for instance, the death of his parents, anyway, my point is that if you're his children raised in the aftermath of all of that, on some level the trauma is understandable if not excusable in terms of how the decisions they make. But then they get into this big beef over who's controlling the license, who's getting the control of the center. None of them, although there are differences, none of them are politically where their father was. But they get into this whole beef and argument. Dexter ends up working with the estate, the official entity in control of all of this, and then with IPM, which is this group here, who determine who gets to use King and for what purposes. And in this case, they get to determine that it is appropriate that Dr. King be associated with this game Fortnite. And again, Dr. King's daughter had no involvement with the Fortnite March Through Time event. But as it says here, we've seen these tweets. Let's see. The decision to use King's speech and footage came from Intellectual Properties Management, a for-profit corporation and, quote, exclusive licensor of the estate of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Bernice King states that the decisions around licensing her father's intellectual property are outside her personal purview. However, the official PlayStation blog description mentions an interesting point. March Through Time would not have been possible without the contributions of American Family Insurance, the DuSable Museum of African American History, and the estate of Martin Luther King Jr., which, well, of course that would have to be the case. Okay, I don't know, but wait, the above wording doesn't direct. Okay, so this article I think is actually confused. Sorry, I was looking for this quote from the IPM people. The estate would be involved because that is Dexter King. Bernice King runs the King Center, and is so therefore there's no conflict here. But that's not the piece I was looking for. Apologies for that. Let me try this one here. Yeah, let's look at this one here because I did want to at least share from their perspective what their claims were, which I thought were pretty interesting. Time and Fortune have teamed up. The event is called March Through Time. Time Studios, by the way, Time, of course, who famously had Hitler and Mussolini as men of the year and stuff like that, right? And was like the Luce family, which are, you know, Henry Luce, right, was notoriously racist. So I mean, in many ways, this is perfect. But okay, here, this is what I think I was looking for. Time Studio mission is to embrace innovative new formats to tell the world's most impactful stories. We are thrilled to introduce our first ever gaming experience and expand our groundbreaking The March Project, which started as an immersive exhibit into the global educational event March Through Time in Fortnite Creative, said President of Time Studios, Ian Orifice. Wait a minute, is this The Onion? Is that really this? I'll just mess with you. I know it's not. I know. My bad, everybody. Forgive that. Epic Games and Fortnite community creators have been instrumental in bringing this powerful content to millions of players, and we are excited. Look, I know my last name is Ball. I can't be making fun of anybody, and I know that's not this. Anyway, I'm just saying. Anyway, we are excited to enable the next generation to explore Dr. King's historic impact. And while it's definitely new, most people are pretty sure this isn't the way King's words would have been immortalized. Imagine fighting for your own life and equality, getting assassinated, and then now your legacy will be a bunch of kids calling you that guy from Fortnite. That is messed up. Okay, so but their claim is that this is a new way to, in an immersive way, introduce people to Dr. King. But as I looked up and found interesting, and why I'm arguing that unfortunately it's logical that King end up here, is that Fortnite and Epic Games, but Fortnite in particular, have a long, apparently, history. I've never, I had never, certainly never played, but I've only seen like one brief glimpse at it some years ago. But apparently they've also had appearances from Drake, Travis Scott, John Wick, Batman. They've been associated with, they've had World Cup tournaments. They've had Star Wars themes. So bringing Dr. King, who has been intentionally reduced in popular culture to a brand, bringing him to this is again perfectly logical. And again, why I'm arguing he had already lost this battle. And essentially that's it. I mean, it just stands perfectly to reason that he would end up here. And their claim, of course, would be that this is a new way to immerse people. But if you are, first of all, hold on, Dawn. I almost missed this. That's right. Viva Panama. That's right. Let's go. Although on some level, and let me get now, on some level, I love Panama and Panamanians, but the political origins of it are really indicative of why Huey Newton was right about intercommunalism. There are no nationalisms or nations to which we can decolonize. All of these nations have imposed a reactionary intercommunalism, and we need a revolutionary intercommunalism that is in many ways boundary and borderless, and certainly stateless. But Viva Panama, I appreciate you. I got the point. And I do remember that Boondocks episode, which I thought was one of the few Boondocks episodes that was as bad as it gets, and was another sign that the cartoon, the medium is the message, could never be the political animal that the original cartoon strip was. The televised cartoon, which I had a lot of fun watching, is funny. Season 3's opener about Obama is genius. But in many ways, the show was a radical departure away from the radicalism of the strip. And that episode in particular about Dr. King, I thought was a complete mess. And I had a short but pleasant, disagreeable discussion about that with the brilliant MC who does the theme song, my man Asheru, DC Hip Hop in the building. Shout out to him. Good brother, does good work. Was, I think, unfortunately biased given his relationship to the show. and incorrect on that issue. But they depicted Dr. King, I remember it vividly, in a number of incorrect ways, starting with remember Dr. King was confused as to what to do, and disparaging in his discussion of where the community was. And the living king was very clear, as we heard in the clip at the beginning of this segment. He was very clear about the impact of pop culture, mass communication, advertising, propaganda. He was clear about what was even happening to his own image and his relationship to his own movement at the end of his life. So I don't think he would have been confused as to what to do or as to what happened. And I don't think he would have been that disparaging of Black people and blaming them for the problems. When in his own lifetime, remember, he said, look, we don't condone crime, but he said the crimes that you point to that Black people commit are derivative of the broader crime of capitalism and the violence of economic and white supremacist injustice. So I didn't like that. I didn't like that. And he did the pound cake. That's right. I didn't like any of that, the whole, and that's right. Asheru and Blue Black. Shout out to Blue Black as well. Really good brother. But yes, Asheru. I am the stone that the builder refused. He killed it on that joint. And then when he was performing live with the L's, in fact, I mixwhatilike.org. It's an audio, but they did a live, the L's, his band, his live performing band. They came into the studio, did a live on-air rendition of that track. That's, I think, better than what you get on the theme song, because it's more funky and in live. So go to our mixwhatilike.org and check that out. We disagreed on that one. We disagreed on it. Yeah. Judo flip, chop, 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 and Oprah becomes president. Yeah, exactly. So now, speaking of which, it's important to note that moment that I was just describing took place at the mighty WPFW 89.3 FM in Washington, D.C., which is currently headed up by our dear sister Katia Stitt, who is the program director and is still in need of support for her medical bills and conditions and situation. And I am, hopeful that folks will follow what's I put in the chat and share the link and encourage people to support her, because I couldn't have been there doing that show that night. And I don't even think she was program director that particular night yet, but her involvement with the station, her engagement and support of me and our whole hip hop block, which at the time was the only and the first block of hip hop on a national network, and certainly on Pacifica. Shout out to Mark Bolden, who was my colleague on that show, with DJ Two Tone Jones, and I don't know if he was there that night, Dr. Bolden. I don't know, but absolutely, this collabo he's describing here is easily a top 5, featuring Asheru, Raheem Devon, Talib Kweli, Raheem Devon, DC Zone. So anyway, please support Katia. Please show her some love as one of the many people who work underground and beneath the surface, doing the kind of work that doesn't get credited, doesn't want the credit, doesn't know that I'm doing this, doesn't, and is just a good person that needs our help. So, and yes, Aaron Magruder grew up in Columbia, Maryland, which is why so much of that show resonates very clearly with me. He got a lot of the dynamics of growing up out here correct, and also showed that from anywhere, even these tree-lined streets, you can get some critical analysis and even some revolution. So shout out to Aaron Magruder. for that at least. Anyway, so anyway, that's it. I'll go through and see if I missed any questions or comments. I will wade into the chat here a little bit, but I just did want to respond a little bit to this Fortnite whatever joint. And oh no, I wouldn't have been. Oh, would he have been salivating over the McRib? Yeah, and he would have been noting that the cost of it is too high and represents capitalist exploitation of the workers, who he would probably be saying deserve full health care and at least $25 an hour minimum wage. So yeah, he'd have been eating that rib, but also talking about how those workers need to be better treated and how the food need to be a better quality. So absolutely. Nope, I didn't say I was lagging, and I don't know why I would have been lagging today. Oh no, anarchist liberal Dr. Ball can't understand Comrade Starlin. Now I'm an anarchist liberal. God damn. That's what I get for looking in the chat. This is more like it. Appreciate you. So I don't think it's bizarre that King's family would be careless, honestly. And I meant, I don't mean to take it lightly. I think they grew up in an incredibly traumatic context. And their own father in his own life couldn't even protect his own actual position on things. So to expect that they would be raised in a condition and in position to advance where he was, given not only their father's assassination, but the devolution of that movement around him and around them, and the whole COINTELPRO strike that in the subsequent decades against more radical, I don't think that they could be expected to be, I mean, look at the we've even talked about, a couple, Dr. Burroughs and I have talked about this a little, like look at the children of a lot of our icons. Unfortunately, it's hard to maintain, what their parents were doing, because the context their parents were doing it in is different. So I try to give them a little bit of a benefit, at least in terms of trying to understand how they got where they got. And then we can just disagree with we could just disagree with some of their decisions. But yeah, his kids were pretty young. So anyway, good people, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it there. I appreciate you coming through. I definitely, please, do continue to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell and do all those things. I'll be back with our Mix What I Like on Friday. I think we're going to be on Wednesday morning with Mama Julia Wright to talk about Richard Wright, the UN, the new book, Mumia, and political prisoners and the work she's doing around that. And maybe Dr. Johanna Fernandez will be joining us as well. And then we're going to have some other specials coming up to cover your Boom Bap breakfasts the rest of this week, as we resituate ourselves. Now that we got back, as man, it took. So this is what I was going to say. Let me tell this little story real quick. So I dropped my oldest, at her high school, where she hadn't actually gone yet. And as I watched her get out of the car, as she's walking into the school, this is deep now. This is deep. I said, man, I was like, and we had been listening to the radio. So as she's getting out of the car and starts walking to the school, work with me now. Picture yourselves, your own beautiful daughter, whoever you need in this image for yourself. Picture them walking into the school, towards the school. And as they get out of the car and start walking away, the song the Temptations' I'm Losing You starts playing. And I know obviously the context is different, but I was like, damn, she's walking, and there's that line where Ruffin sings something like, I'm giving another man has control over you. And I was like, oh, and she's walking past the principal going into the school. And then I see her go into the building as the hook, I'm Losing You, is playing. And you can see her walking in from outside. It's like a perfect movie set. From outside in to the school, and through the windows, you can see her going to her seat under the sign of the school name. So many contradictions. It was terrible. Now, before I lose another friend who wants to chastise me for our family's choices with where we send school, because I don't want to hear it. The question should be, what have we all contributed to this revolution to make this decision, this contradiction, a non-issue? Don't keep pointing to the individuals, just like I said about the king's children. Don't keep pointing to the individuals. Let's look at the context of our choices. Anyway, but it was a beautiful, that shot. I was like, if I was doing this as a movie, this would be a hot scene right here. Anyway, like Fred said, peace if you're willing to fight for it. If I didn't see it, we'll catch it later. Or if you sing this later after the live, definitely let us know what you think by
put it in the comments.
Click that like, that share, subscribe. Come on back this week. Check the other stuff. Sundays with the Ear Doctor last night was dope. A lot of great content on and coming. And with that, peace if you're willing to fight for it, like Fred Hampton used to say. And I'll catch you next time here at I Mix What I Like Live and Black Power Media. Peace, everybody. I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. What I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.